Planning Commission to order at 9:12 or whatever it is. And for roll call, we will note that Commissioner Ogle and Commissioner Nelson are absent by pre-arrangement. Otherwise, all commission members are present. Is there a director's report?
Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission, Nash Gonzalez, yes, I do have a director's report.
Excuse me, I forgot the determination of legal notice, and we need to do that. Do we have a determination of legal notice?
Item 60 was not noticed properly and will be removed from the agenda. All other items were noticed properly.
Okay, thank you. All right, now director's report.
Thank you. Just quickly go over. On April 5th, the next Planning Commission, we're going to have Chris Wilkes, the Little Lake Fire Department chief, come in and give an informational talk on cannabis extraction and the process. And I think because the Planning Commission is going to be taking up the facilities ordinance, then I think it'll be a good opportunity for information to be provided to the Commission, and it'll create a segue. So I just wanted to alert you to that. This week we had 2 planners start in the department. One planner is returning, who left us in October, and we have Keith, who is sitting here in the audience, who comes to us from Lake County. So slowly but surely we're starting to add staff again. And then I wanted to go ahead and also just bring the Planning Commission up to date on what is happening with regards to the Redwood Valley Fire. Just give you some quick numbers here. As far as the administrative permits that have been applied for, we have 55 that have been applied for that allow for the temporary establishment of travel trailers on property. 48 of them have been issued thus far. So we're starting to, quickly move through those. As far as building permits in the area, we have had 23 building permits issued. We have 29 remaining in the queue. So we're starting to see a little bit of rebuild. And 212 sites have been cleared and released to property owners from the county. So moving on, next Wednesday, the 21st at 6:30 p.m., there'll be another community meeting in Redwood Valley at Eagle Peak School, where a number of topics will be discussed for fire victims and the community in general. And then on Saturday, the 24th, there will be what is referred to as the Coming Home Rebuild Expo at Mendocino College, which is going to provide opportunity for vendors, builders, and so on to come together so that fire victims can participate and see what's being offered. And then the county will also have the building department there to provide information. And with that, that would conclude the director's report.
Thank you. Any questions for the director? Okay. Matters from the public. The Planning Commission welcomes participation in commission meetings. This item is limited to matters under the jurisdiction of the commission that are not on the posted agenda and items which have not already been considered by the commission. No action will be taken. Is there any member of the public who wishes to address us? Seeing none, we will close that part of the agenda. Look at the consent calendar. There are no items on the consent calendar, so we will move to the regular calendar, case UM 2017004.
Madam Chair, this is an item that's before you. It's the referred to as a use permit modification to an existing resort and recreational facility at Camp Navarro. And project planner is Eduardo Hernandez. I believe this is his first time in front of the Planning Commission, and I just wanted to go ahead and introduce him. Why you haven't seen him before is he has been maintaining the front counter and processing a lot of the admin permits, but now it's time for him to come before you. So with that, Eduardo, take it away.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, good morning. I'm presenting here the modification to use permit number 2017-04. This is for it's a modification to a major use permit number UR 8982 2009, which is set to expire on 2034. The site is located in Navarro, about 1.5 miles northwest of the town center, lies on the east side of Masonite Industrial Road, which is a private road, and it's about 0.8 miles north of the intersection with Highway 128, located at 17525 Masonite Industrial Road. The site is about 46 acres, and its land use is split in forest land and rangeland, and the zoning is timberland production and rangeland. The existing use at this location is resort and recreational facility with temporary events during the last 3 years. The applicant / owner of the property requests to allow up to 6 special events per year with a maximum attendance of 1,500 persons per event, and the length of each event will be 4 days maximum per year. In addition, the applicant requests allowance for the sale of beer and wine to the event attendees and guests of the resort and recreation facility, also known as Camp Navarro. Camp Navarro started as a Boy Scouts camp in the 1950s, and it was first recognized as a legal non-conforming use in 1982 through the use permit 8982. Later on, it was modified it was renewed and then modified to expand the use of the Boy Scouts camp. And in the last 3 years, there's been administrative permits for temporary events, in addition to a minor use permit which was recently approved late last year to hold events with attendees count of up to 1,500 all the way up to 2026. This modification to a use permit will be in addition, the request to be in addition to that minor use permit number 2017-03. So the 6 events will be on top of the event known as Redwood Ramble, which would expire in 2026. The key issues on this project were general plan and zoning consistency. However, as a legal non-conforming, and because of the events are temporary in nature, it will be consistent with the zoning restrictions of the property. Therefore, some conditions are recommended to help ensure the site will be kept in its natural state after the event. A key issue number 2 is aesthetics. It talks about lighting and how it could be a potential issue to the neighbors. However, there's a condition, number 20, to ensure that, that the lighting will be downcast and focused in specific areas only during nighttime. So there's that that condition, which has been also a condition in the past, and there's never been a problem reported to a county on that matter. Key issue number 3 is noise. That could be a potential issue because of the events. However, the nearest offsite residence is located about 2,400 feet west of the music stage, and there hasn't been issue in the past. So there haven't been any complaints in that regards. Key issue number 4 talks about water and waste. There are conditions in this modification to a use permit as in the past, and it's never been an issue. So it doesn't seem much of an issue right now. Key issue number 5 talks about protection services. There are conditions to ensure that the appropriate agencies at this jurisdiction will be able to get to the place and in response on a prompt matter. There are conditions to ensure that. Key issue number 6 is traffic circulation. Since the site is located about 0.8 miles from the public road from the public road through a private road, then there hasn't been an issue in the past. And again, there's conditions to ensure that. And finally, key issue number 7 is environmental protection. This project is planning staff. We recommend for this project to be categorically exempt of CEQA per Class 23, which is the normal operations of existing facilities. It has been used in the past 5 years for events, and recently granted for all the way up to 2026, and this being an expansion of the number of events per year. So for planning staff, we recommend approval of this project. We recommend that the categorical exemption is accepted, and also the modification to a major use permit number UM 2017-4, it's granted for approval. Any questions?
Any questions?
I would just ask you, has there been any comments from Rancho Navarro at late? I mean, after you've prepared all the staff report and everything, like at the last minute? Because you've indicated in here that there's been no complaints from Rancho Navarro. Has there been anything recent?
No, nothing. It's been referred to the homeowner association and to all the agencies in there, and we didn't receive any complaints or comments any last minute.
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I would just like to add that going forward, we would do a modification to the resolution and add special condition number 1 following condition number 43 in the resolution, adding the following language that all conditions of approval established by use permit U89-82, UR 89-82/2009, U6-2013, and all other previously approved entitlements shall continue to be adhered to unless otherwise superseded by the current entitlement. We want to make sure that no condition from the past is eliminated by way of this entitlement. So we just want to make sure that all the previous entitlements are carried forward unless there's a conflict.
Okay.
Thank you.
And at this point, we would like to hear from the applicant, if you would care to address the item.
Green? Hit the button? Or
I think it has to be lit up.
okay.
You're on.
So,
Your name?
Daniel Braun, CEO and one of the owners of Camp Navarro. So, just a little background. So we've owned the property for 5 years. The goal was to open it up to the public, connect people to nature in various formats. So we do weddings, conferences, outdoor ed, school programs. I have a background in hospitality, outdoor recreation, and event planning. So the goal was take a private asset that literally no one ever saw and open it to the public. So as we've moved forward over the last few years, a couple things that have occurred, and this is why we're kind of trying to modify the permit. One is our adult guests were bringing alcohol with no controls, so we didn't have a control over the alcohol. So the goal was to limit our liability, provide controls, and provide better service while showcasing Mendocino wine and beer. So there's a lot sort of under that umbrella of us wanting a wine and beer license, but really it was about liability. On the event side, there's always been sort of this gray area with our permit and what we were allowed to do. So if you think about what I just told you in terms of weddings, conferences, corporate retreats, festivals, we were allowed, as long as it was a camping event with some education, to have fairly large capacity. But I was unclear what the county needed in terms of communication with us. So our former planner, Robert Dostalek, was the one who said, you might as well try to get the Planning Commission to approve the events. And I was like, well, explain that to me. So it sort of was a way for us to clearly have directives about the scope of our events, because the important thing for you to know is our goal is not to hold 6 music events. This isn't about festivals. This is about understanding sort of the scope of what's happening at Camp Navarro with the county and being able to communicate with the various agencies. So I may have a corporate conference of 1,000 people. Up till now, we've just been doing those events, meaning there may not be music, there may not be any coordination with the county, but under our former permit, that was allowed. I just wanted clarity. Robert encouraged us to get clarity. So I just want to bring that as background. We're not here to be like Black Oak Ranch and just be a festival venue. Our kind of day-to-day operations is not festivals. It's outdoor ed, but that can include, like this year, we have 2 whole school events. So 300 families from a school coming to us. Those will be 600, 700, 800 person events. I'm not sure if those are the kind of events that the county wants to know about, but I'll let our local jurisdictions know that we have a large event. So I only bring that up because this process has been sort of a few years in the making based on our demand, but also just not quite knowing how to interface with the county. So for me, it's actually about certainty, if that makes sense. So I'm here to answer any questions that you may have.
Any questions for the applicant?
Yeah, I do have one.
Sure.
Maybe 2, actually. One's a little more specific, and that is the license, the beer and wine license.
Correct.
Did I understand you correctly that you're going to have a license in place permanently, not just for each event?
Yes. The
Okay.
ABC approved our permit 9 months ago.
Great.
In the preceding 7 months to their approval, I was working with the county and Robert Dostalek on that process to understand what we can or cannot do, how to work with the ABC. ABC approved the permit, and then Robert came back to me and said, oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you that you needed to go through this process with the county. And so I kind of started over, right? ABC had approved us, and he said, well, you're now going to need to modify your use permit, which Eduardo can comment. We're not even sure we needed to do under our permit, but I'm happy to have run through the process, and here we are today. But what I'll add is, even though if you approve this, we're not going to start selling alcohol till the end of the year. I have 45 events already booked, selling alcohol to my existing clients, whether it's a corporate event or a wedding. I wouldn't know how to do that right now, even though I have a hospitality background. Their contracts are already in place, so I need to sort of get my ducks in a row to be able to do that. But we already have ABC approval. They had no issues with us.
Then, you just said you already have 45 events booked?
Correct.
So I'm a little unclear on why this permit is limited to 6. Is it just the size of the 6?
I might have 50 people coming for a family reunion.
Yeah.
I may have a Google coming with 200 employees. I mean, we day to day, week to week, we do a ton of interesting, cool stuff. We'll be the new home of the Anderson Valley Pinot Festival. But my point is, we're a community asset. We're also, you know, really our underlying mission is connecting people to nature. So where they come from and in what capacity, a wedding, corporate event, a school group, a music event, you know, we have the operations and the expertise to fulfill. But yeah, we book out far in advance. So our season really starts in 2 weeks, and I don't have a weekend available until November. And then midweeks are full, and so, you know, I mean, we're trying also to be more a part of this community and help people, you know, get exposed to Mendocino County, expose them to local product, our beauty. So we have a pretty healthy, deep mission, and we're in demand. So it's a good thing.
Good.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Yes.
Madam Chair, I think to answer Commissioner Warner's question is The use permit in the recitals calls out for the attendance of up to 1,500 persons in a maximum of 4 days per year. The use permit with the wording in the heading that talks about the sale of beer and wine actually formalizes it so that the use permit not only allows for the larger events, because he could technically have the smaller events of less than 100 with the administrative permit. It's when he starts getting over that number that he actually needs the use permit. But it's just a formality that the way the code is set up, it's based on the number of folks. And then to be able to put in the beer and wine, one of the requirements of ABC is that they have to have land use approval. And so what he would be able to do is to actually take the approved resolution back to ABC that it actually says these are the events and this is what is going to be served there. And again, it just formalizes it.
Mm-hmm. I know we spent an awful lot of time on the conditions for the permit for Black Oak Ranch, but of course it's more complicated. It's on a state highway. The traffic was a concern.
Right.
And then we've had requests for some other venues that have very long, narrow country roads. Your location actually seems pretty
It's pretty
accessible
ideal.
and
Yeah. What's interesting, I mean, you have the information, you know, we have Rancho Navarro, so our closest neighbor is about a half-mile away. And then we're at the end of Masonite Road, which is, you know, a private road owned by Mendocino Redwood Company. So to our, I guess, east is 37 miles of wilderness, yet we have easy access off the highway. It's, you know, it's a 2-lane road. Mm-hmm. We've never had issues with traffic or anything like that. We manage it, and yeah, so I think our location is pretty ideal. But we're also, you know, the goal here is to work with any jurisdiction or neighbors as needed.
so these conditions are fine with you. You've worked
yeah.
through them, and
Yeah.
great.
I have a question. How does the public access your facility on Masonite Road?
Correct.
Okay.
So we have 2 entrances to our property, which one leads into a parking lot, the other leads into the main part of our property. And then as part of our lease, so we have 120 acres that we lease from the Mendocino Redwood Company. It's a dormant maintenance facility, but as part of that, we have parking for probably 1,200 cars.
Okay.
So it's literally on our property line. So a guest parks and, you know, has a 1-minute walk really to get to a cabin or a campsite.
And I had a question for you on these conditions here. I'm enthused about your mission.
Thank you.
And since in your explanation, you've made it clear that what you're looking for is the clarity in the interface with the county. So my
Correct.
question kind of gets to that point. It seems like you're working under 2 different use permits. So do you have the clarity that you need about when you need to comply with these conditions for which events and for which you don't? Because I notice in here
No.
there's some reporting requirements before and after the events. There's also security requirements for certain events, and I know that there's time and cost involved in doing those things. And so I would like you to be able to leave here today with the clarity that you need around when do you need to, for which events do you need to provide that, and for which do you not need to provide those
Correct.
things.
And actually, before the meeting started, I said to Eduardo, you know, there's some uncertainty on my end about how this plays out. And really, to get to your point, which events might fall under this kind of blanket, I guess you'd call it, because, you know, day to day, I mean, we're just a venue that, you know, no one knows not what we're doing, but, you know, a bunch of kids running around, or someone's getting married, and, you know, if they have some music, you know, the permit, you know, we abide by county rules, like, you know, 11 p.m., you know, cutoff, stuff like that. And our neighbors don't hear. From what I can tell is, you know, when I know we're going to be more of a presence, especially to Rancho Navarro, that's probably, you know, that's one of the drivers for me. And of course, the scale of the event, like, I mean, we can host hundreds of people and have the capabilities to do that, and no one kind of, you know, there's no pressure on neighbors or county. But this is, this was really driven by Robert Dostalek. And part of it was also because there's one event that we do, which has music. It's a family camp. I produce it, and Robert's like, you don't need a permit for that. And I'd already applied for one. And he said, pull it. And I said, well, okay. And it got me realizing, well, when do I need that permit? Is it when I scale the event to a certain amount of people? It was very confusing, and it's getting less confusing. But, you know, for me, our goal is to continue forward with our mission and do it correctly. And this has been literally 1.5 years in the making, but until right now, I never even knew if it would be a certainty, right? So it's like, now try to get clarity. And that includes clarity with the ABC, of course, what we can and can't do. So
I'm wondering if it would help to develop, and maybe staff has ideas about this, some more specific thresholds about when you are required to meet some of the conditions under this use permit, and, you know, for which events you're not required to. Because for a large music event for 1,500 people, I can see why all of these conditions are here. But if you're having 100-person or even 150-person corporate retreat or wedding, it's like, I don't imagine you would need the traffic controls and all these reporting requirements.
And that kind of fits in, if I heard the director correctly, you know, that's what we've been doing. We've been adhering to what we've understood the past has sort of guided us towards, if that makes sense. And now it's like, well, more demand, larger events. How do we make sure that no one in arrears goes, well, wait, you know, what's going on over there? I don't want to be that business that also people are wondering what's happening and it's not sort of lined out correctly. But I think that.
So is there a lower threshold? Well, in other words, we know we don't want you to have more than 1,500 people without doing all this stuff. But is there a bottom? Yes,
Madam
Nash,
Chair,
maybe you could
these conditions would only apply to these events where you have the 1,500 as well as to the Redwood Ramble, because again, one of the reasons why I'm citing the special condition is that where the applicant has the corporate retreats or the smaller retreats, you defer back to the other entitlements, the other administrative permits and so on that have been approved. This is only applicable to the larger events. This way there's no confusion as to when it applies.
But I hear the 1,500, I'm not hearing the bottom end of where it applies.
The bottom end would be referenced back to the original entitlements, the administrative permits and so on. So this only covers the larger events and would only be applicable.
Larger than what?
Pardon?
Larger than what, specifically?
If I recall, I believe it's the 0 to 100, and then you have the 100 to 1,000. 100 to 1,000 would be covered under the admin permit, and then the 1,000 and over is covered by the use permit. So things like, as we've said before, private events. Let's say that the applicant is having their own personal wedding out there. Okay, that would not be subject to the entitlements. But when it becomes a business event where they're, let's say, doing it as part of the business, then you'd fall under those numbers of like I said, 0 to 100, it doesn't kick in. 100 to 1,000, the admin permit requirements kick in, which are already lined out in the entitlements. And then the 1,000 and over are covered by these particular entitlements. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to come back and plug in that special condition to pull us back to those old entitlements, so that, again, when And I'll use another scenario, an example. Somebody has a question, an issue, they would call us up, or if they file a complaint, and it's a numbers issue, we just go back to the entitlements and say, no, they're entitled to do this, and here's why. So that, again, that's one of the reasons why we're trying to bring that special condition in there, so that it avoids this confusion.
Okay. Do you feel clearer?
Somewhat, and I think Eduardo and I will continue to line out where there may be gray area. But yeah, I understand. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I think you heard, like, our goal is to not disturb anyone or anything. And so we have our environmental ethos, we have our community ethos. We try to be a good neighbor. When we know there's going to be noise, we're inviting our neighbors to the events. Most of them attend. But I think getting clarity for me on the scope of events, because what if I said, hey, we have 900 people from Google showing up for a corporate retreat. There's no music, there's nothing like that. We're camping, they're staying in our lodging, we're feeding them, they're having meetings, and they're going home. Does that?
That sounds like that would be under the previous use
Correct.
permit.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I wanted to get to, is
Right,
what's
and
the
that's
lower
why I'm
number?
running this to ground, because that's where I'm like, I don't think we're out over our skis, so to speak, in our permit, and we're certainly not disturbing our neighbors. They may see cars coming in, but you know, they drive right by Rancho's Road and up to our property, and you know, so this is where it's more about. And I guess part of the confusion has been like, Robert's like, you should do this. And I'm like, because it was, last thing I'll say, I wanted a wine and beer license. He said, well, while you're going through the process, you might as well, you know, get it, not a twofer, but you're going to consolidate these two permits. It's going to take the same amount of time. And I said, well, explain to me. And so, you know, I kind of said, all right, my priority is the wine and beer license. And he said, if the event thing becomes the issue, you can always get rid of that and come back later for it. I said, all right, that makes sense. So I kind of followed his lead on this, but the wine and beer license was always my priority here, because I wanted controls on the alcohol.
So does that mean that you're intending to discourage your customers from bringing alcohol? I'm glad they're not going to be toing and froing for a six-pack of beer.
That's not going to be their first, the first thing I tell them, if you know what I mean. Like, you know, under the ABC rules, yes, people can still have alcohol on our property if they're 21, but not in our permitted area. And my first operational reality will be that we sell wine and beer, and this is how we do it at this price. And you're not welcome to bring 20 kegs and serve yourself and have your 24-year-old employees doing, you know, keg stands next to the fire.
If I may, I think to add on to what the applicant is trying to convey is that when they are serving the alcohol, they are regulated by ABC, and they're required to regulate the patrons that are coming to the events. And I think also to add on to what's been said here is oftentimes when these events start off, they start off small, and then they need to add additional, I'll say, additional provisions to the entitlement. And I think when he spoke with the previous planner, the idea was if you're going to do this, you might as well go ahead and include everything, so you're not coming back and modifying the permit all the time. And I think that's why it's an all-inclusive here. It gives them the opportunity to serve beer and wine, but also up to 6 special events and up to 1,500 people, so that if he has that type of a situation that he needs to have a large event, it's already covered under the use permit.
Gotcha. Any further questions for the applicant? Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we will open the public hearing on this matter. If anyone from the public wishes to address the commission on this item, please step forward. Seeing no one, we will close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission. Any comments or anything?
I'll give you a motion.
Okay.
I would move the recommended motion with the, I move the recommended motion with the addition of the special condition that Nash made.
Is there a second?
Second?
Commissioner Purnell,
Yes?
Commissioner Hall,
Yes.
Commissioner Warner,
Yes.
Commissioner Kruger,
Yes.
Chair Holdcamp.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
I didn't hear the first comment, so that's approval.
Yes.
Thank you all. Yes. Thank you, Edward.
Okay, we will move to item OA 2018-002, case 6B. Hello?
The mic's not on.
You're kind of a dull rumble over there.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Bill Kinzer, Mendocino Planning and Building Services. We have some minor modifications and amendments before you today in regard to the recently adopted floodplain ordinance that was went through this commission early last year, and then went through the Board of Supervisors in April of 2017. And Chapter 420 of the Division 2 of the Coastal Zone, which contains the floodplain provisions, was repealed, as was the inland counterpart, and those two were replaced by Chapter 2217, a new floodplain ordinance. So with that change, there are some additions or deletions that need to be made to Chapter 420 in the Coastal Zone, Division 2, to take out the floodplain language, and then also some references to the old floodplain ordinance and definitions that are in the ordinance. And then that package needs to be incorporated into the local coastal program and sent up to the Coastal Commission for certification, recertification of our program, of that portion. So we have 4 fairly minor changes today. I've got one additional one that's just that I think you've received. Mm-hmm. It's just a reference to Chapter 420 that was in a section I hadn't seen before. The changes to Chapter 420 to Division 2 are changes to the definitions, and at this point the definitions reference in Chapter 420. We're taking out the definitions, but we're leaving the word in and adding a reference to Chapter 2217. So I did that, and there may be some disagreement on whether or not it's good to leave it in. I wanted the institutional memory of the planner to be aware of the fact that there was a floodplain ordinance out there, and that and it's not in here anymore, and he needs to go to that. But there may be a better way to do that, which we may discuss. Chapter 420, which was the floodplain ordinance that was in Division 2, is being repealed in its entirety, and we are adding just one sentence at the beginning of 420 that references the new Chapter 22.17. So that's fairly clean. It's a deletion of that whole section, which has already been repealed by the board, and sending the reviewer, the reader, to the new Chapter 2217. That's the only thing that would remain. Then we have 2 other instances where we have a reference to Chapter 420 that's in another part. We're just changing those 2 references to read Chapter 22.17 instead of Chapter 420. Finally, and we may want to reconsider that, I'm not positive, we have one minor change to Chapter 22.17 that just references two building codes. Otherwise, there's no change at all to Chapter 22.17.
If I could, Madam Chair, if I could add to that, when we had our ordinance reviewed by FEMA in the beginning before the Planning Commission and the board acted on it, FEMA did not catch that, and there's in the 2016 code, there's actually a reference that they want you to reference the building code. And so when FEMA was advised that the board had taken action on the ordinance, they wanted to see a copy of the adopted ordinance by the board, they picked it up and said, oh, you didn't reference the building code, and that's all we want you to do. So it's a technicality is what Bill is alluding to, and that's just to address FEMA's concern. So it doesn't do anything as far as wholesale change. It just makes a reference to making sure that we do this. And then also, Chapter 420, the way it used to read, it basically provided that the planning division and the zoning administrator were the floodplain administrator. Now we've switched that out to, under Chapter 22, the building official is now the floodplain administrator. And so even more so, FEMA requests that we have that technical language in there just referring to it. And so this was thought that we would just pick that up as a cleanup now as we're moving it forward. So I just wanted to provide that background. Thank you.
And that change is simply on page 21 of your packet, and it's at the bottom of the page, and it's just one small line reference to building codes.
I see it.
Okay?
And of course, there's a fee to send this on to the Coastal Commission, isn't there?
No, I don't believe there is.
Oh, good.
No, not for us.
Okay. Any other questions for staff?
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski with a couple of additional comments on the form of the ordinance that's here and the recommendation. In going over the packet, I think that the agendized, how it was on the agenda versus how it's referred to in the staff report, the change to 22.17 wasn't called out in the agenda. And I've been talking with the director during the items on this issue to see how to move this forward. So my recommendation might be just to note that 22.1 chapter, anything in Title 22 isn't necessarily a zoning ordinance. It's outside of the zoning ordinance itself. And what I would perhaps like to recommend is not making that change here at the Planning Commission level, but discussing it if there's any concern, and then doing that separately by the Board of Supervisors, which would appropriately have jurisdiction on that alone, and then noticing the item for the board as having that specifically part of it. Because Chapter 22, 2.17 applies to the entire county. And the agenda for this item referred to the local coastal program on its own. A minor point, but I'm trying to make sure I can keep this moving forward and yet still have this discussed and make sure people are aware that this is a change we're looking at doing. Even though I think the change is technical, I think the paragraph already talks about existing regulations, which the building code was clearly an existing regulation. In terms of how the form of the ordinance is doing some of the changes, I might recommend in the section, what's referred to as Section 2 of the ordinance, where we're deleting the entirety of Chapter 420. I would recommend installing a new section 005 that would have the sentence saying that the requirements of Chapter 22.17 apply. And I can draft this out in a few minutes or just get direction. But to have a section stating that, not just stating it in the title of, as done on page 3 of the draft ordinance.
Maybe you should do that.
Okay. Do which part?
Draft something
Okay.
for us. And maybe we could take a 10-minute break here. And,
Okay.
And let you do that.
Okay.
And everybody can read their packet stuff that they didn't get to read.
For the other item, sounds good.
Okay.
Oh,
We will
thank you.
take a brief 10-minute recess.
Let's do a long 10-minute recess.
Yeah.
As soon as I heard the word break, I called for her. Yes.
kind of addresses some of your.
Oh, great, thank you. Great, I'm not the only one in the last minute. It helps. I know. Oh, oh, that's perfect, yeah.
And then we're still here at the table. We're not gonna do it, we've got it. Because the county, at the board meeting came out with,
Their blessing moving forward.
do you remember something about everything's limited to 2,500 square feet?
Because
For
I
the-
don't
for the
think
FL
that
and
you
TV?
even need to notice it for a technical issue.
No, that got modified too, and I wasn't at the very last board meeting, so I don't know if it came up again. But what, he started out with that, but then realized because there were other 931 programs. Where did you have the version? He was thinking, oh, in the past, only 25 plants were allowed.
And, yeah, on the phone.
I think I brought it up or somebody.
99, right?
That basically, he actually wasn't limited to square footage in the past.
Here it is.
That's kind of.
That's kind of where we're at.
Right.
But at the other day, we had the Rangeland item
Right.
before them.
Right.
And he wanted to try to put down some of those kind of Forestland TPC stuff.
This one wasn't complete, so I'm bringing you the completed.
We just sat there. So,
I wonder if it's.
so we gotta go, this just happened.
Sure, but I mean,
That's already passed out.
if people were in the.
So this one is replacing this one. Snag that one for me. It wasn't complete.
Oh, so
So
this
that
is,
is the completed copy.
Oh, good.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Okay, yeah, so this one is.
Lots of hands out. Any questions?
yeah,
This
one
is
question.
out, right? Or is this in?
That's out.
Thank you.
These two are comments from the public, right?
So, yeah. These two,
The snow is about.
this is for item 6C. This one and this one are two.
Big fine.
But especially with what's happening.
All right.
So I think that there's like. Yeah.
Because he's watching it on there.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and also it's kind of makes sense. Okay.
Have you met him?
Oh, yeah, I had a good meeting with him and he and I have been emailing it.
Someone said that several times, I don't know. Every morning I come to work.
Well, I mean, it was their recommendation, and it was on part of the thing. What it is, it doesn't amend the end. They didn't advertise the end. I mean, we did it. That's the problem. Okay.
I'm just, it's probably. Everybody ready? You ready? Okay, we will resume, and we are on Ordinance Amendment 2018-002 still, and we're going to hear the new language to be added.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski. So I'm making just two minor changes to the form of the ordinance that's here that we would then move forward. The first is on page 3 of the red line, and that section 3 would instead read, section 3, chapter 20.420 is hereby repealed and replaced to read as follows. And then we would insert the header for the chapter, 20.420 floodplain requirements. And there would be a single section as part of that. It would be section 20.420.005 titled Floodplain Ordinance, with the text reading, the requirements of chapter 22.17 Floodplain Ordinance shall apply to all unincorporated areas of the county located within the coastal zone. And that becomes the reference in our zoning chapter 222.17. So that, in the form that goes to the board, the repeal, we wouldn't have to show all the strike through because we're saying it's all gone and it's being replaced with this. Other second change would be what's happening on the bottom of page 11. The way section 4 at the very bottom of the page was reading was that the chapter was added to the local coastal program replacing chapter 20.420. I'm proposing for two reasons to simply strike this from this form of the ordinance to go to the board. The first reason is because section 3 is already doing that legwork. Section 3 is providing the reference to the requirements of chapter 22.17. Secondarily, the change that we're proposing, given the slight issues with the notice, as I discussed earlier, I'm proposing that those would go directly to the board since they're outside the zoning code, and the board would hear those and have that notice more specifically for them, even though it's a minor change. And I think it's just making it more specific. At times I get hyper-technical, and this is the cleanest way I can keep this moving forward. Lastly, then, what's there as section 5 remains, we just renumber it section 4.
Okay. Any questions for staff on this new modification?
I'd just like to ask Mr. Kinzer if do you agree with that?
Oh,
Does
absolutely.
that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. I guess I still need to do a public hearing on this, right? If there are any members of the public who would like to address OA 2018-002, now would be the time to step forward. Seeing no one, we will close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission. Anybody have any questions, comments?
Not about the floodplain requirements and the changes, no, but I'm not sure what sort of a motion we need.
I think there
Maybe
is
Matt
a
can help us.
recommended motion on the second page of your thing, which is just to recommend to the Board of Supervisors.
Are we pulling part of it to recommend or not? No.
So the recommendation as worded is fairly broad. It doesn't really refer to the attachment, but we've talked about the attachment. That's what will be the basis of us moving forward. The recommendation recommends that the board approve the ordinance amendment, which modifies the zoning code and incorporates the floodplain ordinance, which is still happening.
Then I would make that motion.
And do we have a second?
I'll second
We
it.
have a second.
Commissioner Hall,
Yes.
Commissioner Warner,
Yes.
Commissioner Kruger,
Yes.
Commissioner Purnell,
Yes.
Chair Holdcamp.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and that brings us to item 6C, I believe it is, Ordinance Amendment 2018-004.
Five is the one that's continued. 0005.
Yeah, the 6D is the one that's continued for lack of noticing.
We do have one public comment, but we can't send it.
You ready?
We're getting organized.
Okay.
Good morning, Commissioners. Mary Lynn Hunt, Chief Planner, Planning and Building Services. I'm here today to present item Ordinance Amendment OA 2018-004. This is an amendment to Mendocino County Code Chapter 10A17, Medical Cannabis Cultivation, and Chapter 20.242, Medical Cannabis Cultivation Site of the Inland Mendocino County Code. Chapter 10 is the Agriculture Department's chapter, and Chapter 20 is the Planning Department's chapter. So we're doing both together. So what you have before you today are amendments to our existing cultivation ordinances. These are board directives that have been handed down to planning staff over the last probably 6 months, and you will see as you notice, you've got this one in front of you. There was to be another one. Unfortunately, it wasn't properly noticed. And you will probably see a couple more in the next few months that we're working on as we go through. So there's multiple changes occurring. A lot of it has to do with what's working, what's not working, just state requirements changing. One of the biggest things you're seeing in today's ordinance amendment is the combination of medical and adult use is now all being combined. So that wording is changing throughout the entire document. I'm just going to run down a couple of the items. Under Chapter 10A, I think the major thing that we're seeing is that we're coming up with a definition for disturbance and expansion. Those are two big items that have caused planning staff a lot of heartache over the last several months in trying to determine when an applicant's project comes before us, is this expansion, is this disturbance? So these are two items that will be very helpful to staff and also to the cultivators in knowing what the limitations are. We're also allowing for combination of permit types. There are different, as you know from our table 1, there's different types of permits that an applicant can apply for. They can now apply for several permit types up to a certain square footage. We are also extending the deadline for the sunset areas. If you will remember, the sunset areas are those areas that are zoned, I'll say more residential zonings where there have been existing cultivators. They're allowed to cultivate up to a certain period of time and then they were to be phased out. This allows them an extension to come in and make their application to December 31st. Previously it was June 30th. 2018. They now have until the end of the year to come and make application. We think that's because they will be able then to have a process with that our consultant is currently working on with regards to overlay districts, and we hope to have that procedure in place, and this gives them additional time to apply. There's also some changes for the code enforcement section of the code. Let's see. We are also adding in a section for propagation of starts. There was no square footage. They're only allowed for their mature plants. There was nothing in the code for them to have their immature plants, and and during the growing season they do their starts. They get plants going. Some may not make it. They're able to change into or rotate in some of their crops. So this allows them to have starts in there that do not apply towards their total square footage of the mature square footage. So changes to Chapter 20. Again, we're talking about medical, and we're getting rid of the word medical out throughout the document. We have added in, there's one clarifying condition with regards to industrial zoning districts. Previously on the table it showed that they had to have a minimum parcel size. That is not correct for industrial sites, so we're just making a correction to that. You also have a supplemental memo in front of you that added in some items that weren't part of the staff report you received. Those items are allowance for 1 year of non-cultivation. So this is for people that want to take a year off. And before they'd have to come and renew their permit on a yearly basis. And this will allow them to have a process to, I may want to not grow this year, things aren't working out, all kinds of situations can come up. So this allows them to take a year off. They have a certain paperwork they have to file, but they don't have to have the whole permit process going for that project. The second item is an administrative permit process for setbacks to sensitive receptors. Previously, there's a 1,000-foot setback for cannabis cultivation sites, and it was amended back in August to allow for the way we measure that, and now there is a procedure that would be allowing them to apply if they could not meet that, if they could apply for administrative permit. Similar to what we would allow as a variance, planning staff would have to make findings in order to grant this administrative permit. So topography comes into play, different types of things, and this would be for cultivation. And then the last thing is there was just some, the material and natural flow. So these are just word changes, and both documents, there's numerous clarity throughout that we've made changes through by a definition, a word, whatever. So that's in both documents. We have reviewed this and decided that it does fall into the previously adopted negative declaration, and that we're going to file an addendum to that so it will meet the CEQA requirements. And it meets general plan consistency with our 2009 county general plan. And with that, planning staff would recommend that the Planning Commission recommend approval of the document to, I'm sorry? Did I mention expansion? Oh, I'm sorry. I did not mention that. So one of the directions was looking at and you have a table in your document. It'll be a red line is the easiest one to look at. The problem is on your document it's kind of split, so it's a little difficult. We were told to look at the forest land and TPZ and how possibly expansion would, well, right now administrative permits are required for certain types of grows above a certain square footage. If you are, we were changing that to only a zoning clearance would be required because they're existing grows. If you are expanding your grow, you would need an administrative permit. There's some questions that have come up about the minimum parcel, or the minimum square footage. So staff really needs more time to look into this. So the table that you have before you, we're working with it. And it's not yet a final document that we would take to the board, but we would like the Planning Commission to allow us to go forward with whatever change we find and make necessary, that we can then present that to the board and not have to come back to the Planning Commission. One of the things is we have to make sure that it is consistent with CEQA, and we have lots of things to look at, and time crunch, we just didn't have the time to really put an in-depth look into this. So what you see proposed is not final. It's not our final recommendation. Is there something else you want to add to that? So I'm sorry?
Sorry, 1 second.
Oh.
2,500 square feet.
Oh, okay. So the question that came out at the board on Tuesday was, we had taken the Rangeland Amendment to them, and if you remember, you had it before you maybe last month, and that's where an expansion in Rangeland did not require a administrative permit. It was just a zoning clearance. And because we figured through the CEQA process, it was determined that the baseline was already set at that 10,000 feet. That's what we were looking at. So the board accepted that change. And in the conversation about that, the forest land and TPZ issue came up. And there was a comment made that it was supposed to stay within 2,500 square feet. So anything up to 2,500 square feet was just a zoning clearance. Anything over 2,500 square feet would then require an administrative permit, regardless if it was an expansion or not. So that's where the question came and what the confusion was. So that's what we have to take a look at. Is that what you... No, I'm not explaining it.
So, Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, just to tag on to that, that is the issue that came up, and we're still reviewing the CEQA document, which I think did primarily look at the issue of existing and what was there. So the issue wouldn't be, for environmental purposes, whether or not we look to this 2,500 square foot as the cutoff or the existing use. CEQA would have, I think, we're looking at a baseline point in time, that would be the existing use. So if it was a larger than that 2,500 square feet, an expansion would be between that larger number, say 5,000, and a 10,000. So the issue brought up at the board was whether it was really intended to mean anything over 2,500 square feet versus what may have been existing, which was larger. So we're looking at still reviewing the CEQA document in terms of what we think would be allowed under that versus by whatever would be preferred by the Board of Supervisors. If it would be more restrictive, there's no additional environmental review that would be required. But for today's purposes, we wanted to raise this issue, and if there's any discussion by the Planning Commission, we're happy to have that, just so we can have it here, and then we'll see where the board takes that once this item goes to the Board of Supervisors. We are making changes related to forest land and TPZ here, so I think that this discussion will happen at the board.
So I feel a little unclear, Mary Lynn. Are you wanting us to incorporate this revised table 1 into this motion or no?
No.
Okay, gotcha. That's what
We just
I heard.
want the discussion and public
Okay.
comment on it. That would be most helpful.
Okay. Any other questions for staff?
I did have a question about table 1, because in Tuesday's, well, it seems like there's 2 issues with it. One is the CEQA issue, which may wind up being a separate issue from what the board wants to direct on that. At Tuesday's board meeting, Supervisor McCowan seemed fairly adamant that it was intended to be an AP process for the larger cultivation sites in FL and TPZ. I'm not privy to the background on that, on why that is or why that should be. We may have people here who know. But so for me, there's a distinction there to be made between the CEQA and then what the board's thinking is.
That's absolutely correct.
And that might be one of the ways we could focus the discussion around that today.
Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I have a question about, in the staff report, Mary Lynn, from you, page 3, paragraph D, so it's your first bulleted item on that page.
I'm sorry, tell me which one again.
Yeah,
Paragraph D?
D,
Okay.
the first bulleted item. The concept there is to grant the 2 permits for 2 parcels. I'm just not totally clear what the implications of that are. It seems to me we've heard a lot and talked a lot about trying to tailor our requirements to the small growers, and that this might be a way for corporation grows to be allowed. I just may not be interpreting it correctly.
So one thing that we've seen is people that own 2 legal parcels, they have like 1 grow site and it goes over their legal property line. That's one of it. The other thing is about allowing for 2 permits under what, actually it's 2 types of permits under a single permit, permit. That, that has to do with cost, because every separate permit costs more money, and so it would allow that. But it allows, it still is, there's still, the square footage is still the same on the legal parcel regardless. So it should not, it's not going to allow for anything more than it would already be allowed for a small grower, which is I think it's up to 10,000 square feet per legal parcel. So regardless of where it's located, and then they can just have a single permit for both parcels. And they know there'll be a clause that, if they sell off one parcel, then that one part of that goes away. They're going to have to get a permit for the other side. They have to meet their setback requirements. So there is a process for that. Mm-hmm. But this allows them to then just have 1 grow site on 2 legal parcels. Because we're seeing it. We see a lot of people coming in and having that situation.
Okay. Thank you for the explanation. I think it helps a little bit, but I'm curious about that one. So,
Mary Lynn, I wanted to ask you about your memo. In the red section there, just to understand this, if somebody has a 5-year permit and they want to take a year off, do they keep their 5-year permit, but now it goes till the 6th year because they took the year off? Is that how that works?
Really, they have to renew their permit every year.
Oh, okay, so
they have to come in and pay these fees and do, be up and doing this every year. So this would allow them to not have to go through the whole permit process, but just, there is a form they would have to file.
Okay.
And just say, I'm taking a year off, and Matt may be able to speak to that more too.
Just to clarify, Deputy County Counsel Matt Kudrowski, the change we're looking at for that isn't the redlined version on the first page of the memo. It's the first indented paragraph on page 2. The version on page 1 was it went to the Board of Supervisors, and then we got different direction from that meeting. So placement's different and the wording's a bit different because the board provided direction for it to only apply for 3 different zoning districts. It was just forest land, TPZ, and rangeland. Okay. But the idea that was given to the board last year, and we haven't had the opportunity to come back to amend the cultivation ordinance since then, was to allow for this 1 year out of 5, and that person would not then run afoul of any issues with their existing permit. The issue, this only really applies to people who in phase 1. This is a proof of prior cultivation problem where the goal is to say you can stay where you're at. You had proof of prior cultivation, and in some districts those people couldn't get new permits. If
they had the year lapse.
Yes, if in an ag zone, you can get, if you have a permit now based on proof of prior, and whatever happens, you don't file for it at some point in time. In 2021, you could still apply to grow in that zone. There isn't an issue with proof of prior. That zone is allowed in phase 3. If you were in TPZ or forest land or rangeland, as well as other districts the board didn't include in this provision, then the idea would be if you don't apply for continuously, then you would lose your proof of prior, and those sites would eventually amortize. They would go away over time because they're not being actively cultivated. This was a mechanism to allow the board gave direction on to allow for some ability for a cultivator to take 1 year off out of 5 and then not lose the proof of prior for their phase 1 cultivation site.
And I apologize, that is a huge issue what Matt just spoke about with the forest land, TPZ, and rangeland, because they will sunset out if they're not being used.
I have a question in that same memo, second page, about the administrative permit for the exception to the 1,000-foot setback. I guess I have a little bit of conflict over this one, and it's because I see that for limited, very specific parcels, this could be beneficial or even critical to a cultivator, where they would get that essentially variance, and it may not have a negative impact on health and safety for the community. But I could also see this being one of those open doors where we're just throwing out the 1,000-foot setback, and there's a rush on APs for people to come in and say, you know what, I want to cultivate right next to the school, or right next to the church, or right next to the youth facility. And so I think the devil's really in the details on this one, and I would like to get a better sense about what's involved, really kind of step by step in that AP process, whether or not there's any kind of hearing that could be involved with that. What I would hate to see happen is that suddenly, essentially, this 1,000-foot setback disappears because there's a rush on APs to waive this setback. In paying attention to the news, I can think of a lot of reasons why we would want to be firm on maintaining that setback. If you've been paying attention to the news in Santa Rosa about these folks coming out of the East Coast, and they're doing all of this crazy invasion of sites that they thought were cultivation sites, but they're actually houses, and they're pistol whipping people and like holding kids up at gunpoint. And and this has happened in my neighborhood too, where someone thinks it's a cultivation site, or it really is.
In my neighborhood too, and I live right on the west side.
And so I want us to make this work for our small local farmers, but I am not willing to throw out the concerns about public health and safety, because as my child is walking to or from school, I don't want her being submitted to any possible dangers having to do even with, you know, the feds deciding that they're going to come in and bust today, because that's still a potential reality as well. And so for me, that 1,000-foot setback has really felt like that was the sacred thing, you know, that we're going to maintain this buffer around our places of worship and our youth-oriented facilities and schools. So I would like some discussion on that. It seems like this could be important to making situations work in limited situations, but again, at the risk of repeating myself, I don't want to see this as an open door to where suddenly the 1,000-foot setback is essentially eliminated.
I will just comment before Matt takes off. I think all this was in an effort to accommodate communities that had a long history of less than those setbacks, but had been working together effectively. And I think that this is the beginning of sort of an overlay process, right?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I don't think it's that. This isn't the stepping stone to that. This, as the board has talked about it recently in terms of the reduction of setbacks, one thing that has come up a lot has been the idea that we didn't include here specifically because we think it's generally covered in the first special finding regarding special circumstances, but the idea that there being some kind of quote impenetrable barrier between two different parcels. So the special circumstance for the setback would be if there's a concrete wall. And the board has been focused on that issue of what's separating that would allow for a reduction from the 1,000 feet to some lower number. I'm not aware that the board has discussed the issue of crime and how that bleeds over, or the potential to bleed over across property lines on its own. So the exceptions process is its own thing being covered underneath the overlay. This was specific to just the setback reduction, and if we want to discuss more specific findings today, we can. We're happy to put those in there. As it is, we kind of did look first at general variance findings and use similar language for that for this process, because once you get putting in too many specifics, that potentially this leads us back to amendments in the future. But I just wanted to point out to the commission that the idea of an impenetrable barrier has been raised. How we define that or script that out, we're happy to hear more discussion on that.
What is the state law for setback?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, that's 600 feet to a different range of types of uses. So the state does not include our full list. They do not include churches. So it's a different thing entirely. But there's an allowance in state law that says essentially reads that it allows locals to have different standards. And ours, depending on what we're doing, either are more restrictive than 1,000 feet, or by adding in these different admin permits for setbacks, or changing how we calculate, as was done last August by the board, the setback might lead to a less than 600 feet in some situations, given how that distance is calculated by the state versus the county.
I think we're building the aircraft in flight.
Yeah, right.
Any other questions or comments to staff? Then we will open the public hearing on this item and hear from members of the public who would care to address us. I have Hannah Nelson is my first speaker card. And are we timing? No, I don't think. Okay. How many speakers do we have? Probably less than a dozen, right?
Thank you. Hannah Nelson. As you know, I submitted a memo, and I apologize that it was so late. I got in from the East Coast and didn't really have a lot of time. A few comments to some of your recent discussion with respect to the issue that came up regarding the CEQA versus perhaps what the board wants with respect to the baseline amount of on TPZ forest land of cultivation that does not warrant expansion and an administrative permit for that expansion versus not. Sorry to complicate the way I just framed it. The history, I think, is that, you know, we were all searching for a way to make sure that there was responsible expansion, of course, but then there had to be a recognition that our county's history has been really up and down in terms of what's been allowed and what's not been allowed over the years. So when I helped draft the original 931, 2009 or whatever it was, that was 99 plants and there no square footage. So there may be people in our county, and actually I know that there are, who were lawfully growing more than what later became legal, dropped back down to 25 plants. Then all of a sudden in 2016, maybe they didn't apply under the sheriff's program for 99 plants. Again, no square footage. And they kept it at 25. But now, maybe because the whole state is going legal and they see where this is going, they decided, okay, I'll apply for a permit now and up to 10,000 square feet, assuming they have the right size and the right zoning and whatnot. So what I'm afraid of is that we wind up accidentally penalizing people who are following the law. If they drop down, but they previously had been larger and now are wanting to re-expand, they shouldn't be penalized by having an administrative permit slapped on them as a requirement just because they followed our county's law. With that said, I think under the CEQA analysis, it is a different analysis, which is, it didn't matter whether it was legal or illegal what people were growing. The baseline was the environmental impact. And in fact, Supervisor McCowan, ironically, was very insistent on reminding the consultants and throughout the detailed CEQA analysis that we had to remember this, that this baseline was about legal and illegal. So I believe that 2 board meetings ago, I think I'm getting that right, Supervisor McCowan, this issue came up, and I was not at this most recent board meeting, but the first time it came up in recent time, I think what he was trying to get at, and of course we need to ask him, was this distinction between legal and illegal, but I'm not sure. And he instead was thinking, oh, before it was 25 plants, so we'll call that 2,500 square feet. But I don't think he recalled that under previous years there were larger amounts. So I think that that's a discussion that we need to have with him and see, really, is that what he was trying to get at? And does that distinction really make sense if accidentally we're penalizing people who were just following the law, right? So that's some of the history. With respect to Ms. Wagner's concern about the larger corporations, I just wanted to briefly address that. You know, first off, we have the state law, basically, our category of large is they're small. Right. So everybody here is small compared to the state. So that's number one, and that's not going away, at least at this point. And really what this was intended, this particular provision to allow 2 people with one person with a legal parcel to have 2 different sites under one permit, it actually stemmed from a client of mine who was trying to do the right thing. She didn't want to max out, even though she lawfully had 2 separate legal parcels and she could have gotten full-size permits for both. She didn't want to. Her homestead is on both of those legal parcels, and the ag department actually made her pay 2 separate permit fees, apply for 2 separate permits, which then imposed 2 separate minimum taxes. And it was kind of ridiculous because I thought we want to encourage people to do the responsible thing and not expand beyond what they're capable of. And so that's where the genesis of this issue came from. The second half, which relates to having multiple cultivation styles under one permit, is I went to the board, well, I mean, these issues have come up repeatedly over the past 2 years for me, but really I went to the board in January and I said, look, our small farmers are dropping off like flies. And we really need to look at the things that in a practical, common sense way will help make sure that even though we are sticking to some very tight regulatory mandates, that we help support and look at the things that are absolutely necessary. And I came up with a list of 5 things that I asked for. And one of them was to do this, what I'm calling mix and match style under one permit. And again, the reason why is because small farmers, compared to the rest of the state, they are having to diversify. They have to do everything they can to stay in this game. And it's just not happening at the pace that it should in terms of keeping people. And that's not just the county's mandate, it's the states and competition and big, huge Central Valley stuff. And so I tried to raise some really practical, pragmatic issues where it would make a difference. So the not counting the immature plants, which is what the state does, is important. The reducing fees, still making people pay fees and go through processes, but reducing them where they're unnecessary and allowing people, because our county limits the number of permits per person to 2, okay? And so if we can mix and match styles, if somebody was trying to diversify and they needed, because the marketplace demands that they have indoor, outdoor, mixed light, they couldn't do it. So that was part of the genesis, and then it also would reduce their fees. So I just kind of wanted to explain that it's not about allowing big corporations in, it's actually about trying to support the small farmer. Getting back to a few of the issues that I raised in my memo, and I'm only going to raise the non-technical ones because there's a lot of stuff that was technically brought up, and in honesty, it was just because I was writing, and I know that later on they'll have to be there, and it saved me an extra memo later for the board, so I apologize for so much technical inclusion. And looking at staff's supplemental memo, they addressed a few of my issues, but I do have a few comments. So in the supplemental memo, with regards to the issue of taking a year off, I really strongly believe, and this will of course come up before the board as well, that it needs to apply to all zonings. And the reason why is because even though it's true that, let's say you are 20 or you are 40, we'll be allowed to apply later on in phase 3. So phase 1 requires proof of prior cultivation. Phase 3, which comes into play in 2020, doesn't have that requirement, but does have double the setbacks and additional water requirements and other things. So I believe that even in these other zoning districts, such as you are 20, and I have 2 clients who had to stop because they have cancer, and they just have to take a year off. Because we have non-transferability, they're not allowed to just transfer their permit to somebody. The only option is to take a year off. So if somebody in one of these zones other than what's being proposed needs to take a year off, yes, technically they could reapply later if they're in the right zone, but then all these other requirements would apply to them. And I think that if they step forward and they've proved their prior cultivation, they've done everything, they should also be allowed to register that form, I'm taking a year off, and continue under the same circumstances that they had before. So I would request that we consider that. Also, with respect to the 1,000-foot setback, and I definitely want to address Ms. Parnell's concerns, I think that where it came up originally with respect to having an administrative permit process to consider other factors and impenetrable issues, the type of examples besides a cement wall, because we don't have many of those around, were like a big steep terrain with a ravine intervening, or impenetrable brush and trees, stuff like that, where as the crow flies, it may have been within 1,000 feet, but really, as a pragmatic matter, there was just no physical way for it to be that close. So I think that that's where it came from. And I would also really request that this commission consider allowing an administrative permit process for reduction of all setbacks. So there's an issue that supposedly is going to be eventually dealt with in this exceptions policy that's being developed by the consultant. So there's the overlay, opt-in and opt-out, and then an exceptions policy. The exceptions policy is lagging behind the overlay, which is already lagging behind. One of the examples that I used from the beginning in advocating for the need for an exception policy was a really easy one. If you have a 50-foot minimum setback from your neighbor's property line, and that neighbor says, I don't care, and they're giving you written permission, there is nothing in the current ordinance that would allow somebody to go through a review process and say, may I please have a reduction in that setback. So I'm asking that we extend the administrative permit process to exceptions for all setbacks. So maybe there are specific conditions for the sensitive receptor, and different conditions for a neighbor property where they must agree, the neighbor must agree, or something simple like that. I think it's kind of a no-brainer, and why do we have to wait almost another year for that process when we've already got a mechanism that could work for that? And I have several clients who are in that situation. With respect to the issue of disturbance and the definition of disturbance, you know, one of the things, and Casey O'Neill had also written some important issues with respect to this, but one of the things that immediately hit me is the fire reduction safety. So I had a client ask me about this the other day, and they said, I already have building permits to put I've spent a year getting building permits because it was delayed, and I've done it, I've got my building permits, and now I need to make sure that I have fire clearance. I have to. And so that's really an important exception, is brush removal, and go ahead, make a requirement that no impact on erosion, or that sufficient erosion control measures are in place. By the way, the state already does that. We already are under extremely strict erosion control measures from the Regional Water Quality Control Board and a statewide order. But I think that it's really important to be sensible and allow for certain disturbance to not count in this definition where it's applied, and the two areas that it's applied is obviously with the expansion, but also in, I think there was one other place that it's applied that it would be relevant. And then as far as the expansion, it really is important that we figure out this issue of maybe somebody was at one level, then they contracted because our law contracted the the legal amount, and now they're going back up. And as opposed to as of the date of the baseline, I think it's important that we consider that it may have been at the baseline date that they were at the previous lawful amount of 25 instead of at the even more previous lawful amount of 99 plants, which could have been whatever square footage. So I think we need to consider wording this in a way that takes into account, and that's why I asked that the language be changed to insert or before instead of as of that date. With respect to the adult and medical use, and really this is probably more of an issue for the Board of Supervisors, but I thought I'd raise it here as well. I really think that it's important that we start to look at the other issues that are affecting the viability of this economy, and we're working at the state level very hard, and there are actually indications that they are considering removing the requirement of designating adult versus medical use for farmers, because it's kind of silly. It's the same plant. It should be after testing or when it enters the market or whatever other point that it's designated, because it's kind of silly for farmers to go, oh, the same plant, this one's medical, this one's, anyway. At any rate, my bringing it up here is because one of the proposed changes, I think maybe inadvertently, sounds like it would require a second permit. So in other words, you would have to do one permit for adult and one permit for medical. And again, the state does require that, so I don't want to, try and pretend like I'm snowing anybody. They require it, but my goal is to reduce the amount of duplicate efforts or additional fees and minimum taxes and whatnot. They'll still be taxed on all of their product, but if we don't have to require them to have a second permit, so it's kind of akin to the mix and match argument. If we could also just take this opportunity to restate our local permit types to match the state permit types in terms of the type of cultivation and the size. That would be really cool, because people are making a lot of mistakes when they're applying for their state licenses and they're calling it large, because we call it large, but really large at the state is like 4 times as big. And with respect to, on my memo, page 3, on the red line version, page 15, 10A 17080A1, asking that we really make sure that May 4th, 2020, which is the end of the sunset period, be also the time that people can extinguish and transfer. Because that makes sense. If it's not about when they're being able to apply for extinguish and transfer or apply for a permit, which in this memo of staff is being requested to be extended to December 31st of this year. I'm talking about a slightly different issue, which is the extinguish and transfer program really needs to cover that full 3 years of the sunset, because that was where it came up with, is if somebody's being sunsetted out of their zoning, they need to be able to extinguish that property and transfer it, but they might not have secured a place in that time, and we want them to do it responsibly. And this is another important one in terms of divorcing the proof of prior cultivation from, or not divorcing it, but allowing for an individual to prove their prior cultivation in Mendocino County, even if it isn't on the same property, so long as the proof of prior cultivation on that property that they now want to cultivate is also proved. And what this is really a social justice issue. Renters have had to move, or even responsible people who have moved out of places that maybe shouldn't be cultivated because of the environmental impact, have moved, even if they weren't renters, and they've moved, and yet their proof of prior cultivation was at a different property. Now they're still restricted to only cultivating now in phase 1 on a property that also has proof of prior cultivation. So we're not adding new inventory. We're not, except under the extinguish and transfer, where they extinguish one and then move. This is something else. This is going, hey, wait a minute. There's lots and lots of people who have had to move. And especially as the rules have changed and changed and changed, I really feel like this is an important one to fix, where we're not creating any new inventory and we're just saying, yes, if you have proof of both, then let's allow that. The only thing about the filing of taking a break that I would also like to mention is that that really should be in general for not only for all zoning, but also not just related to the sunset period for any applicant at any time. And kind of more substantively, the request has been made to remove the proof of service or return receipt when code enforcement is filing a notice, and when an order to show cause is being noticed. And you know, my roots are as a constitutional attorney, and I just, this is something that really gets me riled up. The tightening up of the code enforcement procedure and ordinance and penalties and processes was done quite a long time ago, in fact, before the cultivation ordinance passed. And actually, largely, I think that it was a good thing in terms of cleaning up just general code enforcement stuff and how it works. And by the way, the code enforcement division has been doing an excellent job. I really admire them and feel like they're doing a really good job in balancing all of the important factors. But the time frames really shortened for responses. And the board and the public, I guess to a certain extent, and certainly staff, felt that it was important to have quick action. You need to be able to shut something down quickly. And I argued for more time, but I didn't win. So removing this additional protection, and especially, I don't know how many of you have mail problems, but a lot of my clients do, in terms of, and I don't mean to diss any particular post office, but there are some post offices that are just really have a habit of losing stuff or not having it in somebody's box as quickly as they should or whatever. So having the proof that it's actually been served is really a critical component of due process here. And given the shortened time frames for people to respond, I just feel like it would be a critical error. What is the big deal to require it? Just because they'd like it removed, okay, I'd like a lot of things, but I just don't feel like it's adequate protection to remove those critical due process protections. And then there was one item in the memo from the staff that I just wanted to mention, and I didn't really see where it was located in the red line version, but on the memo page 3, on the 1 to 3rd bullet point down that starts with minor changes are proposed. Towards the end there, the second to last sentence says, the changes also clarify that cultivating cannabis while in the application process is an exception to the nuisance declaration only during phase 1. I think that's fine. But then you need to open up the application process for phase 3 long enough before it starts so that people who are in the app can sufficiently apply beforehand. If it's not okay once phase 3 begins, that you, as long as you're in the process, you're okay, okay, that's cool. But then make sure that there's the ability for people to apply so they're not caught like, wait a minute, no, don't start now and we don't know how long it will take. So start the process, the application process beforehand so that people, once that date comes, they're either approved or they're not and they can move forward. It's a small thing, but important. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would care to address the commission?
Good morning, Casey O'Neill. Definitely would like to communicate support for Hannah's memo from last night, as well to apologize for sending my memo in so late last night. This week's been a whirlwind. The setback issue, I definitely understand where you're coming from, Commissioner Purnell. The events in Sonoma have been horrific. We have Cal Growers has a strategic partnership with the Sonoma County Growers Alliance, and there's been a lot of dialogue within the organization in regards to that issue. And one of the things that I would point out is that none of the places that were intended as targets in those situations were in the permit program, had anything to do with the regulated marketplace. And so that's something that's very, very important to note, that regulation, in my humble belief, is the answer to these issues. And so in sort of that vein, I think it's also important to note that the state did make a decision to go 600 feet with their setbacks and did not include churches, as was mentioned by County Council, and that was not without a significant amount of deliberation. And so, to be honest, I was a little disappointed to see Mendocino go with a significantly more stringent set of setbacks than the state did, and I think it's appropriate to be able to have an exception, and I do absolutely understand the concern in terms of not wanting to sort of open a floodgates that allow for things to happen all over the place right up against sensitive receptors. And so, I do think that the administrative permit process is a sort of an appropriate balance there that allows for public input, allows for dialogue, allows for staff to look at the issue, and allows for a potential denial of that AP. So, I think that does strike a fair balance there. One of the issues in terms of the expansion with TPZ and forest land, I think it's important to look at footprint, because, for instance, there's a lot of garden sites that, we have stringent restrictions on removal of trees. As Hannah noted, there are very, very stringent restrictions in terms of the water board programs, CDFW programs, and so there's a fairly hefty interlocking set of regulations that are being applied here, and in the dialogue over the process of the ordinance development, it was, you know, the hair that we were trying to split was the idea that a lot of these sites either were authorized under 9.31 at the size that they were, or they were already large sites, regardless of whether or not they were in 9.31. And so an additional amount of cultivation might not have meant an expansion of site. And so I think it's important to sort of note that, and also to factor in the baseline with CEQA did include all of the unregulated cultivation in the county. So, you know, given the estimates of 10 to 12% participation of total cultivators at this point, that 10 to 12% is significantly below the initial baseline regardless. In my memo, I did discuss a bit about the disturbance concern. You know, a very broad definition of disturbance can then lead to being applied on the ground by county staff in ways that may not have been within the intent of the ordinance. And so rather than diving into all of that, that is the first comment in my memo. You know, again, I apologize for having sent it in so late so that there wasn't more time for review. And it's sort of the same concern in terms of disturbance as it applies to the change with immature canopy, which allows for people not to factor, that immature canopy is not factored in the total cultivation square footage of the 10,000 square feet or 5,000 or 2,500. An over stringent application of disturbance might make it more difficult for people to have their non-flowering canopy, you know, and one of the thoughts that was raised, for instance, was, you know, if I have some goats and I have them clear a patch of poison oak, all of a sudden I've engaged in disturbance. And so there's definitely some concern there about a slippery slope in terms of land use, what a property owner is allowed to do on their land. I would definitely very heartily second Hannah's concern about removing the male requirement. That for me, there's a lot of times where it's, you know, all of a sudden it's 10 days before I've checked the mail, or, you know, there's a lot of people in this very rural county that we don't get our mail as often as we might. And so if the county says, well, you have 10 days to respond to this thing, but you don't get it until 11 days later, all of a sudden you're in a bind there. And so I would be concerned about removing that provision. Definitely would support the mix and match permits, the ability to combine the types, support for the non-storefront retail, the ability for farms to have a delivery service, not to have customers come to the farm, but to have a non-storefront retail service that allows for delivery and those sorts of things is going to be something that is very, very important for our cultivators moving forward. Being able to get product into the marketplace is a huge hurdle right now. Support absolutely for the eliminating the difference between medical and adult use. You know, just cannabis, call it cannabis, give us a permit for that, we'll deal with the state. And we are, as an association, working very hard at the state level to remove the adult use versus medical distinctions for cultivation, and like Hannah said, push it to after testing. And I think that's about what I've got, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to comment. This is, as always, a very complicated, complex issue, and I very much appreciate all of the hard work and effort that goes into it. Thank you.
Anyone else? Seeing no one, we will bring it back to the commission. I'm not sure. I think maybe the best way to approach this would be to start from staff's main memo. First, maybe we could decide if we want to incorporate the things from Mary Lynn's memo and then go to the public comment issues that were raised. So Mary Lynn has the section 10A 17080 blah blah blah. Sorry, but I can't read all that every time. Which is allowing for the period of 1 year non-cultivation. And anybody have any comments on that section?
Fine with me.
It's fine with me too. Anybody else have any questions for staff about that? So is that an amendment that we would agree should be proposed in here? Okay. As far as the setbacks issue, I think maybe we need a little more discussion on that one. Anyone care to start?
It seems to me that the administrative permit, good idea. The administrative permit redlined information here addresses somewhat what you were bringing up about the possible threat of a grow site. It seems to me that a lot of those things, the in NII, the granting of such reduction will not materially be detrimental to the public welfare or injurious to the property and so forth. It seems to me that speaks to what you were concerned about.
And I guess I would have a question for staff about that, because it's so site specific, because there are definitely places where an exception would be just appropriate all the way around. And then there are those situations, which are probably the ones that we're not thinking of right now, where it would be detrimental or could be detrimental to public health and safety to grant the exception. And I understand the pitfalls of, for instance, putting in like a 600-foot minimum, because that may not be appropriate for a certain site that would be applying for the exception. And I understand the point too, that the more specific we get, the more that it sort of opens this up to having to come back and revisit the whole process and make further changes to this ordinance. So I think my question then comes down to how planning staff would deal with these administrative permits, because what none of us have control over is how many people are going to apply for it. We don't know if it's truly going to be the exception or if there's going to be a rush to the door for this stuff. And so whether planning gets one of these APs or 500 of these, would you just indulge me and walk me through the process of what you'd be looking for, who you'd contact, the types of questions that you ask, and really like the level of discrimination that you would use?
So the application is administrative, so we do it in-house. Rarely do we send it to any type of public hearing, but we do have that process if we need to. We would internally review it. We would then figure out specifically what the sensitive receptor is, and that site would then receive notification. And we would weigh very heavily on the comments we get back from that group, whatever it may be. We do have, we have to look and it's a planner's call, because we're doing it administratively. They have to then, is there special circumstances? And if they can't make these findings, it's denied. I mean, they can just deny it. And they've got to make all of these. So it's just not, they can't play back and forth with them. They've got to make them all, in addition to ones that we already have in our administrative process within the cultivation ordinance that exists. So it is planner by planner, how they look at it. Once they've done their report, then myself or the senior planner would then also take a look at it. So it's got two eyes on it, maybe sometimes three. Sometimes we're looking at it in our staff meetings and everybody's taking a look at it. So no one person just makes this decision on their own. Especially, I think these, until we have a good idea of how we're going to, it really depends on how many we get. I don't honestly know how many we're going to get. There's probably been just looking at existing permits, there's probably been several that have been turned away because they can't meet the criteria for setbacks. So there's not a lot. There's, you know, if there's, I don't want to estimate. I have no idea. It will depend. Those first ones we're really going to have to take a hard look at because we're doing it as we go along here. And like I say, that site will be notified, and I don't think we would notify adjacent property owners. I don't see that because that's not really the issue, but it would be whatever the sensitive receptor would be.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know that site itself would be notified.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
And in
Sorry.
In no case could the setback be less than 600 feet, correct? Since that's the state law.
No, because the state law does allow the local jurisdiction. They
So it could
leave
be
it up
less.
to you. And since we have a process to do this exception, I think it really depends on the site. I don't think there is a minimum.
I support the administrative permit. There have been several people who have testified before the supervisors showing their exceptions. And there are some exceptions out there that just make these regulations look ridiculous, like a barbed wire fence with razor wire where kids just can't get anywhere near the garden. There's one out in Pinoleville that is that way. And I think having the administrative hearing and letting everything out on the table and getting it totally exposed is going to allow the opportunity for an exception if it qualifies. And I think this will make it qualify. I really have a hard time believing somebody would apply for an exception and get it through this process if it was, as you suggested, having a kid walking home from school right by a garden. I just don't see that getting through this system. So I support this the way it is.
Okay, anybody else? I did want to go back to these issues about the definitions of disturbance and things like that. I do think if it is not clear in the language that we are allowing fire safety and brush removal for those kinds of purposes, we probably need to clean that definition up a little.
Chair Holtkamp, can we ask that, because we were talking about the setbacks, can we have kind of a board consensus or a commission consensus and just finish that topic and then we'll move on to the next one? It's clear for staff if we do it that way.
I was assuming it had to come in the motion.
Not in the motion, but just a consensus for if you're supporting this or not right now as an administrative permit.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, based on the conversation, I support it.
Okay, thank you.
Me too.
Okay. So I did want to get a little bit more clear about this definition of disturbance, just because I'm interested in fire safety, and I definitely want people to be able to do that and not have that be part of it. I'm not really wanting to wordsmith that particularly right now. If Matthew wants to do that, that would be fine. But I do think we need to at least have in our comments to the supervisors that we want a sense that normal kind of property maintenance disturbance doesn't count. I agree that storage areas for things like soil amendments, the garden shed, the tractor, the hose, the whatever, should not be counted as part of that area of disturbance. You know, if you put up a little metal shed to put your soil amendments in so they don't get rained on, I think we need to kind of be a little more clear for folks what that definition is. Myself, well, I don't know, look, do we want to just talk about the disturbance thing and then move on so we can kind of complete all those?
Yeah. Yeah, well, certainly the slope of a site would make such a huge difference as far as what a disturbance is. And I don't know how that's taken into account, but.
Well, it does seem to indicate that they want us to comply with best management practices from the state Resource Control Board, and I would be okay with that as a definition myself, but I don't know if that's how others feel.
The disturbance they're referring to is an environmental disturbance, right?
Yes.
And a water quality disturbance.
Right, and we're already assuming there's not going to be any water disturbance because that's
covered. Yeah.
That's covered in another section, but.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Sorry, Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski. I'll start this. We're calling in Jesse Davis from the planning offices to add some more to the discussion. But briefly, I was working with him earlier, and this definition was sourced from documents of the State Water Sources Control Board. So exactly whatever modifications we might do to that, we'll see what that does to it. But there was a basis for this from somewhere else, not just something we came up with. So that's kind of.
And he will be able to answer if they account for fire safety, brush removal, and things like that.
I think we may need some more discussion on that. But in terms of any other questions on those issues and how we might be working on this, I wanted to have him here for that discussion. And we can also talk with Beth if she has any comments on that as well.
And what about the expansion issues? Well, oh, Jesse, you're here. You're gonna talk to us about disturbance?
I hope so.
Okay.
Good morning, Planning Commission. Jesse Davis, Planner 3. I've been able to keep informed in terms of some of the discussion today, but happy to address any questions in terms of how we'll be determining expansion moving forward, hopefully. Yeah. So for our determination, we utilize language coming from the State Water Resource Control Board. We felt that their definition of disturbed area in particular was a good jumping off point for us, given their importance in the cannabis cultivation permitting process. So much of our language and sort of orientation towards disturbed area comes from the State Water Resources Control Board, which published its final policy statements in October of 2017, I do believe. So that really served as the template for us to sort of determine how to look at expansion, particularly with the lens of our ordinance for these particular zoning districts, TPZ and forest land. But that was the basis for our determination, and the generation point was the State Water Resources Board.
And so do you feel like in their language, that they consider things like fire safety, brush removal as disturbance?
I wouldn't feel comfortable speaking to that level of detail, but I do think that they take into consideration those aspects. I'm not sure how to answer that question best.
Okay.
It seems to me that these are agricultural practices that, if you're allowed to do them around the margins of a vineyard, for example, and there's a vineyard I walk in and came around the corner and said hi to a guy with a big tank on his back, killing all the poison oak with Roundup.
I fully, and I recognize sort of the constraints that we're put in given the language of our particular ordinance and how we look at specific dates and time in which disturbances are created. And that is, another overlaying factor for us when considering how to look at disturbed area and sort of the historical aspects of, how that particular clearing or cultivation site came into existence.
Well, I think we probably all agree that fire clearances are important and worthy of effort, and that we don't want to penalize the cultivator for making their site fire safe. The phrase in this definition, all activities whatsoever, I understand it came from elsewhere. It's very iron-fisted, and that might be one to consider softening just a little bit, or if that is left in there, allowing some exception for fire clearance, fuel load reduction.
I would agree with that comment. Yeah.
Yeah, I do too. Because sometimes I think these are made by much more urban people than we, and they don't have our constraints around brush removal, and we've all had a pretty hard lesson about that in the last year, so.
Through the chair, Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, we can take some direction from the commission to consider some language changes, because I'm not sure I want to do anything just specific on that just yet. My first thought was disturbance doesn't include things that might be otherwise required by law. Something if we think that's reasonably direct, and that's why I'm not sure I'm happy with that language yet, but something where we're linking to where we think it actually would be either not just allowed necessarily, but maybe that's required, and see, maybe reach back out to the water quality control boards and see what they thought about how they were looking at that language, if they had any view as what they were looking, for those things when they drafted the language to begin with.
And I would be comfortable if we're just recommending to the Board of Supervisors that they get clarity on that point. Whether it's from the state or whether they want to modify the language themselves, but we think that's an important issue that is unclear in the present language.
That would also address the water tank issue that Casey brought up too, because if a certain amount of forbearance is required and someone's got to have, in the tens of thousands of gallons of water storage to get through the dry season, if that is a requirement, then the language that you mentioned would address that as well.
I am totally okay with the take a break thing. So I don't know if anybody else doesn't agree with that, but I think it's perfectly fine for people to file to take a break. And I think that probably is a good agricultural practice some of the time, so. Well, I mean, rest your land. I know people do that with their gardens and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Any other issues either raised in staff's memo or the comment letters that anyone would like to discuss?
What about that return receipt requested?
Oh, I agree with that. I think that should be required, just because it's actually come up for me within the last month of how long it takes to get passport stuff back through our mail system, and I live right in town. So our mail, if I want to send a letter to my next door neighbor, it goes all the way to Oakland and comes back. And there are many places that it can get lost on the way. And so I think that return request or return receipt is kind of an important thing myself.
Well, I totally agree with you. You're talking about issuance of an order to show cause. And now somebody comes in and says, well, I never got the letter. I think that return receipt requested should be put back in there. Not
I agree.
removed.
Anyone else have different view or?
No, I would agree. I'd be curious to hear from staff on that, though.
So, Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, through the chair, that was brought up by our, the code enforcement attorney in our office. So I talked with him briefly about it, and he is not here today. I can't ask him to come in for any more elaboration. I believe he wasn't considered. Did not get into detail with him exactly how many times they've used it or the issues that had caused as part of the code enforcement process. So whether or not we want to address it as part of a recommendation by the Planning Commission, or is in terms of the resolution, or make that part of our staff report that you had concerns about it, I certainly would want to make sure he had an opportunity to discuss the issue in front of the board as to why code enforcement thought that was a reasonable change. But I can't give you much more information on that right now.
I believe that Mary Lynn, sorry, it's my other friend. That Mary Lynn's report mentioned speed, that it was slowing down the process, but there are a lot of things that are slowing down the process. This might be too important to do away with.
So I would, again, if we have a process out of this where we can make recommendations to the Board of Supervisors without changing the document, I think that is one we all seem pretty agreed we would like to make strongly, that requirement that they get return receipts should be continued, not eliminated.
So, Madam Chair, what I have been already working on was red lines for the recommendation section of the resolution. And I'll make changes to what was paragraph 3, which is in terms of recommending certain things go forward to the board. And then I might do a new paragraph 4 about consider certain issues that we're talking about today. And I'll try and see where this fits in between those two.
I wanted to raise the issue, and I think this is a question for staff. Is there a separate permit required for the M and the A permits through the county?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Gadrowski, no. And that wasn't intended, I think, to make that statement there. I think we were just wanting to say, and I don't have that page up on my desk right now, but the state is wanting A versus M, and that's the state's issue. For our purposes, I think all we were looking to in that one addition was to say, let us know if you're doing an A or an M or some combination thereof. So I think at some point the state's going to want to know who's growing what where, and we just wanted that noted. We didn't add anything there that each type will be issued as an A or an M. So I think that's, if we need to clarify that between now and ordinance adoption, we can look into that, but it was not idealized as requiring there to be specifying you have a type 2, A license or A type permit. That's why we didn't. A license is actually the state version of what they're doing. We're calling our cultivation permits to be different. So we didn't actually define, well, just to try and clarify that we're not an A license or an M license, we're not type licenses by the state. We have permit types here, as noted, because they are somewhat different than the state. So we didn't define all our permits as A or M types for that reason. To just make sure we didn't want to get into that issue, but we thought it made sense to at least note on the plan what there would be, just to be consistent with whatever the state's doing.
Great, thank you for that clarification. I'm glad there's not an extra layer of red tape here. I'm looking at the bottom of page 3 on Hannah's comments, and this was the issue of 3 years to extinguish and transfer. And if I understood this correctly, since we're looking at moving some of the dates elsewhere, it might warrant looking at moving those dates here as well to make sure that there's a 3-year separation. Do I have that kind of right?
Yeah, it's really about making sure that the 3-year sunset period and the 3-year right to extinguish and transfer match each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the right to extinguish and transfer matches the sunset.
Mm-hmm. So if the intention there, if the original intention was to allow the cultivator 3 years to do that, it seems like this should be moved. I don't know if that was part of the rationale originally.
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Gadrowski. I'll see if Mary Lynn has any other comments as I go along, but the last sentence of that paragraph A1 refers to the relocation site provisions in B3, and that's on page 16 of the redlined ordinance in front of you. Towards the bottom of that page is the B3, and the very first subparagraph there talks about how people may apply to relocate their cultivation site pursuant to this paragraph B3 for 3 years after the effective date of the ordinance adopting the chapter. So that gets us to the 3-year period there. And at this point, I would probably just try and clarify it in front of the board in terms of timing. But the issue I think we're looking at is people in sunset areas. I believe the intent was they should apply for that sunset right now to be there at that current location, and then they have 3 years to, until the end of the 3-year period to find that relocation site. I'm not sure that the intent was necessarily to allow for a leap right ahead, not apply for anything up front in the sunset period and then wait. But I would probably, at this level, just defer to the board for additional comment on that. But that's how I believe it was intended to read.
Thank you. And just one more question too from Hannah's memo here. She clearly took the time to give really specific recommendations on making technical language changes. And am I understanding that that is something that will be done at the board level and we don't need to do today?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I don't think those have to be addressed. Those kind of technical changes within 10A17, which it's not a zoning ordinance. It is a land use related ordinance, which is one of the reasons we bring it along with changes in the zoning ordinance to the Planning Commission. But those are level changes that we are happy to take a look at between now and the board, see if we are able to incorporate those by that point in time. The general rule in the government code is that anything that the board does that has not been considered by Planning Commission would have to go back to Planning Commission. Since we're talking about her memo and those changes, if we can just take general direction from the Commission to consider those and move them forward. I think many of them are technical in nature and probably could be made or should be made in some cases. But I don't know we have to go through every one of those now.
I do think that, especially because of the whole sunset period and people having to change, that the questions about prior cultivation should be addressed by the Board of Supervisors and make it clear for people what their restrictions are. If we are asking people to move, we kind of have to take their personal record and not their property record, it seems to me. That's probably a more fair way to do it if we are especially making people leave certain areas and go to other. I also, the renters issue did move me. I do think there is a fair amount of this happening on land that people don't own. And if they are doing a responsible job and they have to move, it seems like their personal history with their permits would be the governing idea rather than tied to the site.
And I would agree.
Me too.
I'm not sure if we can ever make it not cost more, but. Any other comments, questions?
Well, I have a question, and this may have already been resolved, but in which case you can shut me up with a sentence or two, I'm sure. But in the medical marijuana or medical cannabis that we're kind of is moving out as a distinction we're making, it seems to me when you're talking about security issues that well, there are two kinds of cannabis. There's the THC laden stuff that has adult use sort of written all over it, and then you have, I forget the name of the other.
Cannabidiol.
CBD.
CBC. It has CPD, and that isn't really threatening or as threatening to people who are sensitive receptors. I don't know if that's true. If it's a concept that's in my mind as we're talking, and maybe you can clarify.
As far as staff, I cannot clarify that. Actually, I would invite Casey O'Neill to the podium. I think he's probably the most versed in that and could give us some good information.
So that there's some interesting dialogue here, especially in terms of CBD versus hemp. One of the things we're seeing is, a hemp bill in the legislature, and there's been a lot of dialogue both at the federal level with the FDA in terms of what are the clarifications here. In terms of strains that are grown locally, from looking at the plant, you wouldn't have a whole lot of way to tell whether it was a THC or a CBD variety. And especially specifically in terms of the sensitive receptor issue, CBD varieties generally have strong smells, and so in terms of our functional cannabis definition here, I would say that you're going to see a fairly similar, especially in terms of security concerns. It sort of they all look like cannabis plants, more or less.
Okay, that's what I want.
Thank you, Casey.
So, are we ready for something?
I guess, what?
Anybody want to make any motions here?
I mean, my understanding is that our conversation is the gist of which is your recording, and we'll put in some form and throw it at the soups, right?
Correct. Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski. I'd like a few minutes to try and word what I think, we're looking at, based on what I heard, agreement with the changes as discussed in staff supplemental memo. We're looking at a handful of other issues that I want to go through my notes and kind of itemize before I can either read them out, or if we can put them up on the screen, maybe we can. Maybe a 5 or 10 minute break to do that.
That'd be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, this one that wasn't properly noticed, will you be mailing that out again, or should we hang on to it?
Yes, you can scrub it and send it out again.
Every meeting of the board still are going through this.
I don't know if that goes.
Drilling
If you
down
have
into the
time, go
definition.
grab the stuff you want me to sign.
Oh, we're going to do road package.
Well, they've made some substantial
There's
And
some cases never going to get resolved.
Take a travel there every once in a while.
Good thing this first one.
I have to write it down.
It's been making changes. Since 73,
I'm gonna walk over.
Okay, I will wait.
entertained some kind of rule change. They started in 73, the original forest practice rules were 45 pages. Now they're 395.
That tells you something.
And that's what's going to happen with all this.
Probably.
You gotta get this thing out on the ground and try it. And then come back with all the stuff that you want.
Yeah.
I think we just are now mentally ready to treat this like the wine industry.
Well,
It is like the wine industry.
I think the thing is legalize it, let the market work it.
We're doing this. I think this is going to get sorted out by the marketplace in due time. Yeah.
The whole market is just completely changing.
Collapsing most.
Well, yeah, a lot of it is just plain collapse.
Why not if it's other in the first place? Everybody can just, who wants it, can put a plant on their patio. We're good.
And it's been true for decades. In the 60s, it was the public made this once, and somehow it just taken all this time.
Vote on our recommendation. No, I think all we can vote on is that we're agreed on a recommendation with the supervisors. This language that's in the staff report, plus whatever changes we want to suggest to it.
Which have already.
And Matt's working on that.
There's the accumulating
the aircraft in flight processes, because I like that there's so much exchange with it. I do. This is how it was actually working out on the ground. Then we get to change it.
You only need to put it when you okay there, and I was like, well, I guess I'll do that.
You know, I have a oh yeah, then I would definitely do. I do think, though, that the recommendations that we make to the Board of Supervisors are important, because I think they're a lot more pressure to do it as opposed to what's the right job. So it's our chance to say, well, this is what I think is the right thing.
There was a good article in the square footage and yield of the plants, tonnage. So just if you implemented all of the permits, you get a certain then you had an estimate of
I've never received a regular mail.
and everybody had a permit. That's just California. So the whole thing is going to have to go to that export. And there's nothing legal. You can't legally export.
To take it out of the system. So we might get a handle on that. But I don't think you're allowed to pick winners and losers
What the
either.
state has got to end up doing is somehow get an export. Then the thing will work, because if it just stays in the state, it's going to overproduce.
Somebody thought there was a lot of money in this. Everybody got on the bandwagon, that would be a Washington issue. But that's just human nature, but I do think that very
The market is going to do so much more. But the state But that's what the state wants. The state needs to deal with about 10 big producers and worry about
They're serious people. I mean, they are already. They are. But I think, you know, if you go to the winery, they've done well, built up customer days and a brand and
yeah, I agree. Big corporate
what would you get in taking over the board? That would be a
But, you know, if somebody is some organic grower and they have a great farm, you know, that's how wine clubs work, that's how all that kind of stuff works. They get customer loyalty, they do the things. And that's how people will. You ready?
We were rushing off for a snack, but I had the impression we were on the brink of deciding shutting down.
Well, I guess that I was thinking that for prior cultivators who don't own the land that they cultivate on, that their proof should run with their person and not with the property. And I'm not sure how you do that, but,
I thought,
but that if they have had licenses at one site and they have a good record with that license, that should be their proof of prior cultivation and not the use of property that they don't own and now have to leave.
well, the last
And I'm not sure how.
almost never.
There's a lot of different issues.
My opinion. It's like, oh yeah, sure, fine. Exactly. At that point, it's like people are ready to go.
Issues concerning cultivators who are tenants.
There's no grace. Can't really sit, man.
Okay, would you like to summarize?
So, Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, looking at what's on the screen right now, and I'll make sure this gets to the clerk for inclusion in the final resolution. I'm showing in a red line what I'm adding to the language that was as presented in the board in the commission's packet. So number 3 was the recommendation that the board adopt the ordinance amendment, making the changes shown on the attached Exhibit A. Exhibit A was the staff's ordinance changes as part of the packet. And I'm adding an "and as discussed in the supplemental memorandum presented to the Planning Commission on March 15th, 2018, which is attached to this resolution as Exhibit B, with the exception of this letter A, changes removing the requirement for mail to be sent, return receipt requested in sections 10A17.140 and 10A17.150. I believe that's the only specific change.
You don't think we need to just say we recommend keeping
the wording of number 3 is that you're recommending the changes as done. So this way you're not recommending the changes removing that requirement. I'm happy to rephrase it.
Well, I don't know. As long as you think it's absolutely clear to the Board of Supervisors.
I think it's fairly clear. I hope. And we'll do the packet to make sure it's clear. The new section 4 is similar to what the commission did when it had the cultivation ordinance in front of it in last year. The Planning Commission further recommends that the board consider the following additional changes to the ordinance amendment. And the 2 issues here I've placed because we have no specific issues that we have to fix those with. So A, consider revisions to the proposed definition of disturbance in section 10A.17.020 to take into account removal of plant growth for fire safety purposes or based on other legal requirements. And the goal was trying to capture not just fire safety, but if there is a way to broaden that out for other issues. And then B would be to consider the additional revisions related to clarify proof of prior cultivation requirements for cultivators who previously cultivated as tenants. And this is in response to Chair Holtkamp's concerns regarding that issue she raised during discussion. I believe those are the only 2 issues that were brought up or raised by the Planning Commission as more general requests for additional changes. And if I'm incorrect, please let me know.
Anyone else on the commission have any additions?
No, I'm happy with everything else.
May I make one brief
Yes.
comment? I'm wondering if it should be limited to tenants, since there were property owners who moved for good environmental reasons, that they had to leave their old property.
Oh, because they're being sunsetted out of
Well, not just sunset, but they've just on their own went from an inappropriate site to a more appropriate site. Thank you.
And yeah, I agree with that actually. Or at another location which or just because they've changed locations.
Yeah.
That would work for me. That work for everybody?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, then I think that the motion we are looking for here is that we recommend this to the Board of Supervisors. And I think, I can't remember, was there a sample motion or a suggested motion in here?
There is a recommended motion on page 4 of the staff report. And my only recommendation to amend it would be the first line, adopt the resolution as amended by the Planning Commission.
Anybody care to make that motion?
Oh, I don't have to read it, I'll say it. Recommended.
I don't know what he said.
Yeah, but it says here what he said.
So
I'll second.
Okay.
Commissioner Warner,
Yes.
Commissioner Hall,
Yes.
Commissioner Kruger,
Yes.
Commissioner Purnell,
Yes.
Chair Holtkamp,
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Okay. Moving right along, are there any matters from staff?
No matters from staff unless there's questions.
Any questions? Any matters from commission? Seeing none, we will move on to the approval of the November 16th minutes.
I had one correction to make, and that's on the front page. Under Commissioners absent, it was written none, but I was absent, and it's referred to later, so we just need my name there.
Any other changes or corrections? Do I have a motion?
So move.
Anybody want a second?
Second?
Okay, hello. All in favor, we can just do this by voice vote.
Yes.
Aye.
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 And I'll abstain since I was not there.
And with that, can we have a motion to adjourn?
I move we adjourn.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So you don't want us to keep 6D, right?
I'm saying get rid of it because we're going to be updating and putting it back.